Hi, everyone. Right now, we're going to look at some of the pre Protestant Reformation renewal, reformers, and revivalists in the centuries leading up to that time period. But I have a provocative question to ask you as we begin this section. Um, was the Protestant Reformation a revival, a renewal, or something else? I want you to think about that question because, from a Protestant perspective, we think about it in terms of a revival, but it isn't necessarily so when we consider what the Protestant Reformation accomplished. Certainly, it helped establish a new form of Christianity and that galvanized and gained political power, helped reform and rethink what Christians believe today regarding orthodoxy. But did it touch the heart? Did it change? It certainly changed people's minds, but did it change people's hearts? And that's an important question to ask when we consider the impact of the Protestant Reformation. Um, but there were a number of factors leading to the Protestant Reformation that occurred. Certainly, the Great Schism, where the leadership and the Pope of Rome moved from Rome to Avignon, France, for a period of time, and then at its worst point, where the Roman Catholic Church had three different popes. It really led to people questioning the authority of the church. Papal taxation, as nation states began to rise in Europe, they objected to paying taxes to Rome more and more. And the rise of these nation states helped also helped to certain groups of people to have a bit more independent thinking that was less focused on Rome and more concerned on their more local needs, both economically, spiritually, and politically. The printing press helped lead to the quick expansion and expression of new ideas, and certainly it helped spread the Protestant Reformation as it began. The emerging middle class in Europe was a significant economic reason. It objected to the corruption in the church and to the church, gaining more and more property, the church courts, and certainly church taxes. The Renaissance and the new ideas introduced at that time also helped bring about some new ideas about what Christianity really meant and what we believed. Um, there were also geographical changes with the opening of a new world to the west, the beginning of religious diversity that was still under national control until 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. Um, and finally, the failure of the Roman Catholic Church to meet the needs of the people. All of these were factors that led to the Protestant Reformation. But notice that most of these were not necessarily spiritual reasons. There were a lot of political and economic underlying reasons as well. But let's look at some of the reformers. One of the first and most well known is somebody named John Wycliffe. Most of you probably know him actually by the modern ministry that's named after him, with Wycliffe Bible Translators, because John Wycliffe was known first of all, at least in the English-speaking world, as the first person to translate the New Testament into vernacular English, and it also was consequently dispersed, and printed versions were made more available so that people could have access to the Gospels in their own language. Eventually, his followers also translated the entire Bible into English as well. But he also founded a movement called the Lollers, which protested against papal authority and emphasized scriptural authority, and they're widely considered a precursor to the Protestant Reformation. He also disapproved of the celibate priesthood, rejected the concept of purgatory, which were widely concepts that were widely rejected by the Protestant Reformation as well. And he died of natural causes, but actually at the Council of Constance, 31 years after his death, his remains were exhumed and burned, and those ashes were thrown into the river as a statement of the church against his teachings. But who else? Certainly John Huss was a precursor to the Reformation, and probably in many ways he was probably the one reformer that brought more spiritual renewal and lasting spiritual renewal. It's certainly a legacy of it that we'll talk about in a minute. But he was in what is now the modern Czech Republic. Certainly in 2015, the Czech Republic voted him as widely considered the greatest hero of their nation. And so he is still a very popular figure in that republic, but his teachings were widely spread throughout this region of Europe. He helped establish spiritual renewal and reform as a leader in the church. And really, he helped successfully establish the first Reformation movement in Europe 100 years before the official start of the Protestant Reformation. And his teaching significantly influenced Martin Luther. But probably one of the most lasting legacies that he brought about for spiritual renewal. And by the way, it's estimated that somewhere close to 1 million people in Europe were saved as a result of his teachings and his influence. Even at that time, a significant percentage of Europe was drawn to Christ because of his teachings. But the most lasting legacy, I would say, for the purposes of spiritual renewal, was a movement called the Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren, that came out of his movement and helped establish something called the Moravian Church. And if you haven't taken Church History and Renewal 2 yet, you certainly will hear about the Moravian Church and their influence upon establishing global spiritual renewal in the 17th century, or excuse me, the 18th century, and their influence on modern missions with their sacrificial service to foreign missions work. They also really are the forerunners of what is called the 24/7 prayer movement, because they established a 24/7 prayer movement in their chapel in Herrnhut, Germany, which lasted nonstop for 116 or 117 years. And as that movement began, they preached. They had focused preaching on the baptism in the Holy Spirit. Anyways, that was just a significant legacy that Jan Hus, or John Huss, as we pronounce it in English, that he left on renewal Christianity. Girolamo Savonarola was certainly another figure, although his influence was a little bit more short-lived because of persecution. In Italy, he was a very, very popular preacher and prophet in Florence, Italy. He challenged papal authority, encouraged reform. His prophecies drew large crowds and became enormously popular, but ultimately he was burned at the stake in 1498. There was still a significant percentage of people who followed his teachings in Florence a century later, but eventually, because of persecution, their beliefs were widely disseminated in that region. Lastly, I would say, and unfortunately we're running out of time for this section, so we'll talk about Martin Luther a little bit in the second part of this lecture, as certainly not as a precursor, but as a pioneer of the Protestant Reformation.